You absolutely need to tune in to this episode. Maybe one of the most informative episodes that I have ever put out. I do think it's the longest episode I've ever put out as well. I am joined by Matt Ross, who is the Director of Conservation at the National Deer Association. And we talk about some mind-blowing things. We talk about a deer's dispersal. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to listen because I didn't know what he was talking about. We talk about deer's home ranges and core areas and how those change over the course of their life. We talk about different influences that are going to determine a deer's movements. We talk about changes throughout the deer's life that determine when they move, how they move, where they go, when they go there. We talk about changes throughout the year. What changes throughout the year determine a deer's movement. We talk about excursions. We talk about the way that hunting pressure changes deer and how long you need to give those deer after you've boogered them up before they'll come back and you can keep hunting them and go back to normal. We talk about the single best days to hunt in a week. We talk about the single best days to hunt in a year. We talk about when all the conditions line up and this is the day that you need to go hunting. We talk about weather. We talk about moon. And spoiler alert, we talk about how weather and moon don't play as big as of effect on deer as you think they do. Guys, it's an incredibly informative episode. It was a very fun episode. I learned a lot. I literally a couple different times scratched my head because Matt tells us some stories about deer doing some crazy things and going on 100+ mile excursions. Just mind-blowing information. And I promise you, you will leave this episode having learned something about deer that you didn't know. Guys, as always, this episode is brought to you by our good friends over at ScentLock. But stay tuned in right here and learn something new about whitetail deer from Matt Ross and the NDA.
Welcome to Bear Archery's Hunting 101 podcast, where hunters new and old come to learn and find inspiration from stories of hunts gone by. Everyone is welcome to enjoy the outdoor way of life, and there is no better time to start than right now. So let's head into the great outdoors with your host, Dylan Ray.
Guys, if you've been around hunting at all, you've probably heard of a little company called Muddy. I have learned that if it says Muddy on it, I can trust it. From tree stands, ground blinds, trail cameras, to all the accessories. If it says Muddy, it's a name I can trust. I love their tree stands. I love their ground blinds. I love their trail cameras, the new Merge and their Morph cellular trail cameras. They're phenomenal, especially when you pair them up with a solar panel and they last forever. Guys, I would encourage you to check out Muddy for all your tree stands, ground blinds, all the accessories, bow hangers, harnesses, everything tree stands or ground blinds or accessories related. If it says Muddy, I know that I can trust it. Guys, I know the new Rage. The new Rage is these super light tree stands that cost like $400. And I'm like, well, why would I spend $400 on one when I can spend $100 and get 4 tree stands that are all going to perform? They're all going to be safe. They're all going to be comfortable. Guys, Muddy is the gold standard, in my opinion, for what a tree stand and a ground blind and trail cameras should offer you. So, guys, go check them out. They are phenomenal. And I promise you, if you're shopping at a Dick's, Academy, Bass Pro, Cabela's, anywhere, if it says Muddy, I promise you it's a name you can trust. All right, Matt. So I would be lying to say my goal for this episode is to create an episode to where people want to come back every year and get refreshed on this. I have those podcasts, that I have saved, and every year before season, I want to just go listen to them. That way, going into season, I'm prepared. I'm ready. I know one of those episodes has been the tactics episode that we did a while back, and people go every year and listen to that and get refreshed on the tactics of deer hunting. But I want to talk about deer movement. What influences deer movement? How to predict deer movement? Obviously, as whitetail hunters, we're always in this year-long chess match, and we're trying to figure out when do I go, when do I not go. When's he going to show up? When's he not going to show up? So let's start by talking about how deer move first off, and then we'll talk about all the influences that, might change that and might help us, indicate when to be in the woods and not to be in the woods. So what is your intro to how deer move, like how they function on a daily basis?
Well, that's a great question. And if I had the answer to how deer move in totality, I think I wouldn't be in my
You'd be
job.
rich.
I'd be rich, and I spend a lot of time trying to figure it out myself. I have the advantage of being at least up to date on what the research says, which we'll jump into a bunch of that. The research today in terms of what we know about deer movement is just so far advanced than when I was younger. The collars that they put on deer today, GPS collars, they can call up the exact location within a meter of where a particular deer is standing that has that collar at any moment. They can get hourly locations or even sub hourly locations and know that the deer is standing within 1, 2, 3 meters. Whereas the old days, using the old radio telemetry collars, they had to triangulate it. For those that don't know, that the collar would send a signal, like a radio signal, and somebody would have to go out with an antenna and kind of pick up one cardinal direction, saying, okay, it's coming from that direction, drive around or walk around and get another one, and then get a third one. And where those lines intersect is about where that deer was standing. Not today. Think about our phones, how advanced our phones are today compared to 10 years ago. We know I can find my phone within a couple feet, if I use that part of the app. Same thing with collars. We know where deer are standing. That said, there's still a lot to learn. And it's hard to predict. And, after all the stuff that we'll talk about today on this interview, there's no true silver bullet, that says if you do X, Y will happen, which honestly makes it so challenging and fun from, being a bow hunter myself. I love the challenge. It is frustrating as all get out sometimes, but the challenge is what makes it fun, right? And trying to figure these critters out. And I think if we knew exactly what they did and the odds were in our favor 100% of the time, it would be. So deer are driven by, for movement, two things. The need to feed and the need to breed. They're just an animal like us. They have these basic desires or needs in their life. And most of the year, they're driven by their stomach. We all know that, right? The breeding season, we're recording here in early October. The breeding season for most of the North American white-tailed deer population's coming up soon, not everywhere, but in the next couple of weeks. And they're starting to shift and think more about breeding than feeding. But by and large, they have to eat every day. And so if you're trying to predict movement based on food, that's your number one goal, because they have to feed, really. There's that short period of time where they are breeding, and that's going to drive, by and large, most movement. But from a hunting perspective, think about food first and foremost.
Now, you just said it. You said we're in early October. Debunk this myth of the October lull. To all the guys that say, why are you even going hunting? It's October. The deer are still there. Like, the deer still have to live and function. So why did that perception ever even exist of the October lull and there's no deer? I mean, they don't come out. What's going on there?
Well, there's what happens, as any seasoned veteran hunter, knows, is that you see deer a lot during the summer. They're very visible. If your season opens early enough, where they're still on those patterns early enough in the year where they're more predictable, where they're on their feet, and you see them where they're feeding early evening every day, and then all of a sudden we don't see them. This is before the advent of these collars that I'm talking about, and be like, well, deer must be just hunkered down. Is a guess. It's an old wives' tale, really. That's been just perpetuated, is that deer must be hunkered down because we're not seeing them. And the old radio telemetry studies couldn't really confirm nor deny that, because it wasn't accurate. But what we see today with the technology on these collars is deer are moving more in October or whatever the pre-rut is, for those southern listeners here, if your rut is in like January, February, the month and a half before that, right leading into the breeding season, they're not hunkering down, they're changing what they're doing. And what we see is on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, how much deer are moving in those time spans, on a day-to-day basis. Let's use that one. In the spring and summer and early fall, they're moving, a baseline amount, and going into the October period or the pre-rut, by and large, study after study, I can cite studies in Louisiana, Maryland, Texas, Pennsylvania, where they increase the amount they're moving in that same period of time. Like if it is a daily measure, they're moving more in October than they were in August. And so the question is, why don't we see them? And so the answer to that is there's a couple things happening, two things. One is their food is changing. And again, you can pinpoint where these deer are standing. And so they are changing what they're eating for a couple reasons. New food sources are becoming available, and their needs based on what they're eating are changing. So, in the spring and summer, they're packing on weight through eating as much green leafy vegetation and protein as possible. But going into the fall, they need to bulk up. And so protein doesn't really help them there. They need to put in sugars and fats. And so they're looking for foods like soft fruit or hard fruit like acorns or beech nuts or, apples, persimmons, wherever you are, because those sugars, can be converted to fat, or straight up carbs can be converted to fat based on what they're eating. And they need to put on weight for the winter. So they're changing what they're eating. So they're not in the same places that we saw them earlier in the year. And the second thing is we are our own worst enemy in the fact that we go in the woods and deer respond to that. And whether you're hunting hard or not, just our presence or your neighbor's presence in the woods, they react to that. And so, during the middle of July, we're not out checking cameras or hanging stands or cutting trails or any of that stuff. But humans, people, especially, where I live, there's a lot of people in the woods, in the month of October that weren't out there. We have
Right.
almost 750,000 hunters in our state. So deer respond to that. So those are the two things that are happening. Is they're responding to hunting pressure, and they're changing what they're eating and where they spend time. And so we have always thought that they're hunkered down, but that's not true. The collars show that they're actually moving more than they were in the spring and summer.
They're just staying in the hardwoods because that's where the acorns are and the persimmons
or wherever.
But not only are their food needs changing, but the food that's available is changing. I'm like, well, guys, if you think about it, I'm here in Kansas. So I'm like, well, all the corn has been stripped off now. All the milo has been stripped off now. They're prepping the ground for winter wheat. The beans are gone. All of the summer food sources they were eating are gone. Like the farmers have taken those off.
That plate is clean. They can't eat off of it anymore.
Exactly. And so it's like, you can't expect deer to keep doing the same thing they've been doing all summer. And you're like, well, I've been seeing deer in that field all summer long driving by. I'm like, yeah, there was beans in it. Like now it's a bare dirt field. Like what do you expect? You know what I mean? And so it's almost just now, don't get me wrong. I don't like to hunt in October because it's 90 degrees, but to me, it's almost just a crutch that we put ourselves in, because honestly, sometimes they're easier to kill in October than November. You know what I mean? So that's just my thoughts. But so on a yearly basis,
it holds true during the rut too.
Oh,
it holds true during the rut too. A lot of people think that deer lock down. Same thing as the October lull, that they're going to be like locked down with a doe and they're not moving much. And that there's a little truth to that, but not to the degree that you would see a shift in movement. The evidence that we've seen in collars and how deer move is that over the year, they have the smallest home range or daily movement patterns in the spring and early summer, and it increases every month a little bit more, all the way to the rut, which is the peak when it's the largest, when their home range is the largest, they're moving the most, and then it starts shrinking again back to the beginning of the new year, all the way to the spring. And so it's this annual ebb and flow of them moving more and then less, and then more and then less, and it goes up. And the peak is always during the rut, no matter where you are. Whatever your rut is, that's when deer are moving the most. And the valley is always going to be when they're not trying to breed, and their resources are for food and cover are the most ample. So like think about early summer when everything is green, the crops are growing, they don't have to go far for food. Everything that's leafy is within reach. That's when they're moving the least. And so wherever those months are for you, the listener, that's when they're moving the least versus when they're breeding.
So to see deer nailed down in the summer, you've got pictures of the same buck all summer long. It's safe to say that is his home range. So in the rut, while it might expand, that is the deer's home range because you've seen him in the times where he's going to move the least. Correct?
Yeah, correct. During this, a home range is where a deer is, like if all those collar locations we mentioned before, if I said, I want to know where the deer is standing every hour throughout the entire year and just plotted all those out on a map. And you had this kind of scatter plot of all these little, pins. And I wanted to draw a circle around, not 100% of them, but the majority, like 90-95% of them, because some of them might be these little outliers. That's the home range where the deer is standing most of the time. And then there's the core area, which we can talk about too. But during the summer, that when the home range is really small, they could be literally 100-acre home range. Whereas during the breeding season, that same deer, and I can picture specific graphics of individual deer that had like 150-acre home range in the summer. They were basically just bedding just on the edge of a field, going out and eating and going back and forth. And that same deer during the rut had like 1,000-acre home range. And so it grew like 10 times the size.
Now, what is, if 100, 150 is the small side of a home range, and obviously this probably depends largely on the states and food sources that are available. What's a big home range? Like what can somebody expect, a big home range to be? And what kind of state would that be in?
That's a good question. So generally, the more biodiverse the landscape, meaning, where you have it broken up into woodlots and small fields, the smaller the home ranges are going to be. The more homogeneous the landscape, fancy word for saying it's basically all the same type of thing out there, the same type of habitat. So wide open grasslands for as many, miles as you can see, or straight up big woods for as many miles as you can't see, I guess, or brush country, Texas, it's just miles and miles of the same thing. That's where home ranges are going to be the largest. So what would be a large one? The largest home range I ever saw documented in a study was around 7,000 acres for one individual. That was in Texas. That was in South Texas, in that brush country I just mentioned. And what's interesting, Dylan, is that like it does vary by landscape and by habitat. And it also impacts other things like dispersal and others. But what's always held true, and so it varies, and probably the smallest would be a couple 100 acres, 150, 200 acres, and the biggest would be, thousands. What's always held true is that core area that I mentioned. Now, core area is where a deer is 50% of the time. So that same map that I explained a little bit ago that had all the pins in it, where I drew a circle around 90 to 95% of them, if I were to draw a circle where he was half the time, or if I were to throw a pin at the map and I had a 50-50 chance of hitting that deer, that's what's known as the core area. 50% of the points are spent there. That is always, no matter the landscape, anywhere between 10 and 15% of the home range. And so if you had a deer that had a 1,000-acre home range during the rut, his core area is 10 to 15% of that, so 100 to 150 acres. And so when you're talking about like getting on a deer, like really
so that
knowing
would probably be the bedding
the bedroom
area, right?
of a deer. Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Or the bedding area and the immediate surrounding landscape, so the deer could like get up and eat or
walk
feed
around a little bit.
In some places, they're like 30 to 50 acres.
Really?
The core area. They don't have to be thousands of acres. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, if a deer's home range is 100, then that means his core area is 10 to 15 acres. I mean, that's insane to think about.
Yeah. Now that would be more common in the summer than when we're hunting, which is now this time of year. They're going to be the largest, but it gives confidence to anybody that is hunting small acreage. I hunt small acreage, that not only can I manage for deer at a small acreage and attract deer to a small acreage using that management, but I can also try to protect or grow deer. If like you see an individual deer that you see year after year, he's basically yours to either mess up on or kill, because that's his home range. He's not changing over time. In fact, the research also shows the older a deer gets,
the more home range space he gets.
The smaller the home range gets. Because
just like old
if
grumpy
you think
men.
about it, yes, they've made it through the gauntlet, right? The older a buck gets, they have averted death probably more than once. And so they remember, they have a memory like we do, like humans, of where risk was the highest, and they don't go to those places. And so when a deer is younger, its home range is its largest, and over time they actually shrink. Same thing with core area. They get smaller as they get older.
So that is why I tell people all the time, I don't hunt early season. I hate hunting when it's 100 degrees. I don't. But that's one of the best times to kill a big deer, to really nail him down and know where he's at when he's going to be there. My favorite time to hunt, if you were to say, Dylan, you've got one deer to nail down and you want to kill him, I'm going to wait until late December when it's about 4 degrees outside and dumping snow.
Yeah, you nailed it. Honestly, where we started the conversation is you said, what are the baselines, or what are the big picture in terms of deer movement? And I said the need to feed and the need to breed. Those are the two things. And most of the year it's the need to feed. Well, that's our seasons, the way they are laid out in every state and province that I know of. I don't think any of these exist. They open up at a time when the need to feed is still very high, and they end at a time when the need to feed is still very high. And so that predictability, I said I can't really predict where deer go. Well, the predictability is highest when it's super hot out and uncomfortable with bugs and humidity, or when it's super cold out and you don't feel your toes or your fingers, because deer have to eat at that time, and their need to find food is still the thing that's driving what they do.
Yeah.
The rut is a ton of fun to be hunting, and I get out every year during the rut, as pretty much every deer hunter in North America. But it's when they're least predictable.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Now, so here's what I always say: if I want to kill any deer, if you were to say, hey, pick a week to go kill any deer, it's going to be November 7th through the 15th, 16th, somewhere in there. But if you say there's one deer that you want to nail down and kill, when are you going to do that? Again, it's going to be, December 20th through the 30th. That's when I'm going to nail that deer down. Or just depending on, like, if there's a massive, massive cold snap December 3rd or 4th, then yeah, that's when I'm going to nail them down. But like all these dudes plan their vacation time for November 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, which, don't get me wrong, just like you said, I'm going to go hunt those. but those are going to be
Yeah.
more of like, I get to run out for an evening and sit, not I took off work for a week. I take off
because you
work for
never
a week
know.
and I take off work for a week in December because that's when I can really, have those deer nailed down on a winter food source and they're coming to it every day like clockwork. So I'm going to kill that deer. I mean, I've got videos of deer. You look out over a winter wheat field and there's 250 deer in this field and people are like, that's fake. And I'm like, no, that's late season. Like that's how it
Yeah.
works. So that's now so the largest home range of any deer at any point in time is going to be a yearling during the rut. Because if it gets smaller, as they get older and it's the largest during the rut, then that means the largest theoretically, obviously this is no like 100% all the time, but theoretically a yearling during the rut will travel the most, have the largest home range, and then the least will be an old mature buck, in the summer months, July, June.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. Nobody's actually ever, I've done, interviews or talks about deer movement. Nobody's actually explained it that way. There's a caveat there. Yes, you're absolutely right. That is the continuum that exists. The caveat is yearling. I would say that on the front end of that, the largest would be a 2.5-year-old during the rut, because the 1.5 age class, or yearling as you're describing, they're still going through something called dispersal. That's another unique aspect of deer movement, is that when deer are born, they inherently, most bucks do this, like the vast majority, about 3/4 of all bucks leave where they're born, and about 20% or so of does, to 15 to 25% of does. But deer typically leave from where they're born when they're about 1.5 years old. And they're finding where their new home range is going to be. And the reason that happens is, obviously, if deer stayed where they were born, the chance of interbreeding is pretty high. And I don't think deer think about this, but it's just something that has developed within the population, is that there's this migration of, if you will, or basically movement of deer that are, you have deer that are born, fawns that you saw during the spring or summer of this year, that will go a mile or 3 or 5 away, and that's where their home range are going to be. But you're going to get deer from other places. So dispersal is happening in that first adult year, and because of that,
never heard that.
Yeah, it's an relatively unknown thing that happens. For folks that do know it happens, they feel like, how can I reduce that? You almost don't want to reduce it, because you want good genetic diversity, because it'll ensure the best healthy deer herd. And so, the best way to manage around that is to work with your neighbors, because when deer are born on good ground, when I mean good ground, like good food and cover, they have the best chance to grow the largest antlers in their life. That first year really makes a big difference, not only for the fawn eating, but the doe and her milk production, and that first kickstart of nutrition that the fawn gets will ensure the largest antlers for that deer. If a deer is born in poor environment, like the ground does not produce a lot of food, or the milk is not producing the most nutrients, that deer will never realize the largest antlers that it will have. Now, we're getting off a movement here, but to bring it back
this
to deer
does
movement,
determine movement. Like this does help with movement.
Yeah. And honestly, the better the ground, the shorter the dispersal distance. Instead of going 5 or 6 or 7 miles, deer will only go 1 or 2 or 3 miles away. But the best way to manage around that is work with your surrounding neighbors, because if they're managing their habitat and you're managing your habitat, all the deer that are being born in the town that you're in, or the block of roads within that range that you live in, or what have you, all of those deer are starting at a higher bar of nutrition, meaning they're all going to produce better antlers. meaning when you lose deer, because you can't stop them from leaving, they're going to move, and you get deer from somewhere else, you and your neighbors are all starting at a higher plane. That's the best way. And that's called a deer cooperative, is working with your neighbors.
Okay, so what do you say to the guy who supposedly kills generational deer? He's killed grandpa, dad, brother, cousin, and it's the same genetics. It's got to be the son, I mean, what do you say to that guy? Because that deer's son is probably, based off what we're talking about, 3 miles away.
Genetics is an interesting thing. Obviously, half our genes do come from our moms. Same thing with deer, right? And so 50% of the genes are coming from the does that are out there, and they are there to stay for the most part. Like I said, only 15
okay, so bucks disperse, does 20%.
Some does do, but majority stay where
okay.
it all starts with the mom, honestly. And so there is truth to that. And honestly, big antlers are not necessarily all coming from the buck. The does actually have 50% of the say what antlers look like as well,
right?
From nutrition and genes. They have a lineage because they had a grandpa and a dad. The does did. So genes are a fickle thing. I try not to manage for genes, and anybody listening to this is, you can't control genetics. The best thing you can control is habitat and age. Work on habitat and get deer to the age classes where they are most likely to show what they're capable of. You can't control genes. You can't control dispersal. Really, you can't.
Okay, so you just mentioned something, and I don't. We're gonna get off on a deep rabbit hole here, I think, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
And I don't know why this came to mind when you said this, but is there any what is the percentage of your does? What age class of bucks are breeding your does?
That's a good question. No matter how hard you manage, like when I say manage, meaning like you only shoot older bucks that are like fully mature, young bucks are still doing some breeding. Research, this has been done. Randy DeYoung at a Texas A&M Kingsville did this study. It was really eye-opening, where they took DNA samples off of deer that were killed, shed antlers, deer they captured and released, and he created like a family tree over years, generation after generation of deer. And what they found was, whether it was managed or not, at least a third of the breeding is being done by 1.5-year-old bucks. And so even when you have a well-balanced age structure where, you got all these old bucks running around, some of those young guys are slipping in there and still doing some of the breeding. And it's just, just because they're young doesn't mean they don't have good genes. I'll say that too to the listener. I mean, a young deer is only going to have small antlers because of their age. They might have giant antlers when they're 5 years old. Their genes are not a product of how old they are.
Yeah. Once a spike, always a spike. That's a myth too. Like that's been debunked long ago. But I heard
deep in a rabbit hole now.
Yeah. I heard even more of a staggering number though, because I thought it was somewhere in like the 60% are bred by 3.5 and under.
Well, and I thought it was. It's that same study. And all they did was identify deer up to 3.5, and so 133% are yearling, and the rest 67% are happening at 2 and 3. That's probably what you heard from the statistic, but it's still a good balance of breeding. And again, I'd encourage or stress to the listener, don't worry about who's doing the breeding. You can't control that. You're not standing there and telling them not to do it. It's happening at night. You can let bucks get real old and young bucks are still doing the breeding. Don't get tied up on that. The thing
you can only
should
control that
about,
one. There's only one time you can control that, and that's when they're breeding.
Them.
You can wait until they're done before you shoot them.
Yeah, or remove them. I mean, taking a deer out of the population certainly controls that, but even that doesn't have any control. Yeah.
No, I found that interesting.
Going back to dispersal, that's an interesting thing because it's spreading genes out, and it's ensuring the best diversity and health and rigor of the population. And one other thing in terms of movement that talking about home range that comes up is something that we didn't even know until we had these newer collars on, is called excursions. And so it's confused with dispersal, but they're different. So what dispersal is when a young deer is moving, it's a one-time movement, leaving where it's born and setting up its own home range. Once they're there, they're of that 1.5-year-old or older age class, they're your deer to grow, provide habitat to, pass up, shoot, whatever you're going to do. Bucks and does for both sides. Then excursions are when a deer is at least 2 years old and it's got its home range where it is, year long. It doesn't go outside of that, with the exception of an excursion is that bucks and does do this, where they will leave their home range that 95% of the time, that outlier I mentioned earlier, and they go half a mile, 3 miles away, and then they come back. We didn't even know deer did this until GPS collars were invented. Because when the guy went out there with the antenna, holding it up, trying to triangulate the location of the deer, when a buck or a doe was on an excursion, they just couldn't locate it, and they thought, well, I'm just not getting a good signal today. Maybe it's the cloud cover. Maybe that deer's down in a coulee or a valley, and I can't get a signal. So they'd go back to their office, go out the next day, and maybe they'd pick the deer up and be like, oh, there he is, or she. There they are. And so we didn't know they were leaving. How long do these
excursions last?
On average, about 16 to 24 hours, but they can last days. But think about this, Dylan. Think about this. You are watching a buck, or I'll flip it around. You have a camera every 50 acres on your property, or every 20 acres. You know almost every deer out there. Then all of a sudden, this new deer shows up in the middle of November or late October, a buck that you've never seen before, and then he disappears. Or on the flip side, you've been watching a buck so closely every year, and he kind of goes away, quote unquote, goes away for a week or two, and then shows back up. Or even worse, not to take it away from another hunter, but you hear about somebody shooting the deer, and then you find out that they did, and you got his sheds and pictures of it 1.5, 2 miles away. Well, that's what an excursion is. They do this. They will leave, and they'll go on average about a day. They'll be gone. But the longest documented cases could be like literally dozens, 20, 50 miles. One case in Missouri was documented of a 3.5-year-old going 186 miles away from its home range.
What?
So some real extreme stuff. Yeah. But the average is like 1 or 2 miles away. Yeah.
Oh my Lord.
Yeah. That's an extreme outlier, but for the person that's hearing me and saying, oh man, last fall I got a picture of this absolute slob of a deer that I'd never known before, or my neighbor killed a buck I've been tracking and wanted to shoot, that buck never went over there. That's an excursion. They do this. And bucks and does do it. They do it year round. It's not just breeding related. More happens in the fall as their home range is getting bigger and they're chasing does, but they happen in the summer and the spring as well, and winter. Deer go on excursions, and they generally last a short period of time. They're out and they're gone, and they come back.
Okay, so 2 questions. How many excursions does a deer go on a year? Roughly. I mean, obviously there's no cut and dry number. And then what stops a deer? I've often wondered this. What stops a deer from going on an excursion, finding a better place to live, and then staying there? Like, like, and I picture like a classic Disney movie. Like they stumble upon this beautiful place with like creeks and food and trees and shade, and they're like, "Why haven't I ever known about this place?" And then that's their new home. So do they never, ever, ever relocate? Like find somewhere better, and they're like, yeah, this is my new home now.
Okay, so I'll blow your mind here in a second. There is evidence that a segment of the deer population has multiple home ranges, what we call dumbbell home ranges. They have a home here, and then they have
Then
a
a vacation home.
a couple
Those are the
miles
rich
away,
deer.
a vacation home. So let's get into that in a second. To answer your first question about how many will a deer go on, by all evidence that I've seen, I've looked at like a couple, well, not a couple dozen, maybe like 6 to 8 studies that have been tracking excursions, and not every deer does it. About half of bucks anyway will go on excursions. Half of them won't. And so there is this kind of thing that we talk about in the deer management or deer research world about deer personalities. Like some people are homebodies; they like to be home a lot and they don't like to travel. And some people like to travel the world. My sister-in-law is like a world traveler; she likes to go everywhere, and I like to be home. Kind of using that same theory in the deer world. Some deer, and we've seen it from when they were fawns. Some deer are like to be around home, and some will go on, be more of a wanderer. And it's about half of bucks will go on excursions. And I mentioned that we know this from a fawn. This really cool project that I got to learn about a couple of years ago actually had, talking about deer personalities, had collars on does, GPS collars, and they also had collars on those does fawns. And you could see some does had their home range and core area, very, they had a very clearly defined home range and core area within the home range, and the fawn never really left that doe's core area. It was always where mom was standing 50% of the time. And there were some fawns that had the personality that were more of a wanderer, where the mom had a home range and core area very clearly defined, and the fawn's home range, when they overlaid it, not only was it pushing the limits of the core area of the doe, but the fawn was also pushing the limits of the mom's home range, meaning it was like doing its own exploring outside of where the mom was going normally. So that was just a real brazen individual. It liked to move around a lot. And that held true for that deer in all likelihood as it aged. Like its personality stuck with it. Now, I digress for a second. Going back to excursions, I said about half of bucks go on them. The ones that do, about half of them do it about 3 to 5 times a year. It doesn't happen a lot. The other half only do it about once a year. So it's not like it's happening a lot every week. Otherwise, if they did, it would be that deer's home range. If they were going all the time, that would be measured as its home range. But these are more like 50% of the deer don't go on them. For the ones that do, about half of them do it multiple times. About half only do it once a year. And the ones that go multiple times, they're doing it 3 to 5 times a year. Now, you want to talk about the dumbbell shaped home ranges? That's the thing that's crazy.
Yeah, 100%
okay. So this is where a deer will have a very clearly defined place where it spends a ton of time, and then it's usually broken up by season, where the other part of it, like if you want to call it as vacation home, it spends a lot of time, and it will travel between the two a couple times a year. And so I'll give you a case study in how I picture this. There's a buck in a Louisiana study that it was actually done for University of Georgia, but the study site was in Louisiana. It was like 3 or 4 or 5 years old. I can't remember, but it was an older deer that it in early or mid-March, it had its home range for the winter, which would have been the breeding season there, going into like February would be the peak of breeding. And as the breeding season ended, going into March, mid-March, which would be kind of the tail end of their post rut, that buck went 6.5 miles away and set up or not set up, it went to a place that it stayed until August. So from mid-March until August, 6.5 miles away, it was its basically spring and summer home range. And then mid-August, it came 6.5 miles back to get ready for the breeding season and would set up from August, September through March. So basically half the year it was in one place, half the year it was in the other place, and it stayed in those two locations for 6 months. The crazy thing, Dylan, was the buck had a collar on for 2 years. It made those movements the same day, March 15th or 18th, whatever it was.
Are you
Moved 6.5.
serious?
Yeah, it did it 2 years in a row. Around the same day, it would go and go that. And this really neat project that came out last year from Mississippi State University, the researcher was Luke Resop, really up and coming researcher out of Mississippi State. He found about a third of their study animals, at least in that study, so 30% or so, had that mobile personality, would have like those multiple. I think that's probably a high estimate, but at least in that study, they showed about a third of the bucks in that study that had collars on it had those multiple home ranges. Now, I don't think they were 6 miles away. You know, he showed a couple of examples of 1.5, 2 miles away. But so you got this continuum here with personalities. Some deer, like the fawn I mentioned earlier, that was the real homebody, you know, the Matt Ross of the deer world, that probably goes on a dispersal. You know, the majority of bucks go on dispersals. I said before, about 3/4 of bucks disperse when they're 1.5. So let's take that deer at 2.5. So this is the low end of the continuum. That deer sets up its home range. It never goes on an excursion. It has a small home range that shrinks over time. That's on the small end of the continuum. On the other end of the continuum, you have a deer that is a wanderer personality. It likes to move and might even have multiple home ranges and goes on multiple excursions from those home ranges. That deer's all over the place. And then there's all this stuff in between. Yeah, I know. And just imagine every scenario that could happen in between that. You might have some deer that are more homebodies, but they go on excursions. You might have some deer that bounce back and forth between these places, but don't go on excursions, you know, all the way up. And then you have age and food and season that plays a part of all that too. So all of these influences play a part on deer movement.
Okay, this place in Louisiana, was there anything that you guys could look at and be like, oh, that's why? Like in the summer months, this place has a lot of water and creeks, and in the fall, this place has a lot of winter wheat and, you know, food sources. And I mean, was there anything to look at and be like, oh, that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. That study site was not far from the Mississippi River. You got all this deep, good ag ground on and along the Mississippi, which also is subject to flooding periodically. And so that deer's bouncing back and forth, even though I don't know if it was done during a flood, I think must be just adaptation, just an inherent adaptation for being risk averse, you know, trying to make sure that deer is the most safest at the times it needs to be the most safest, and also capitalizing on food when it's available. And so one home range was centered right in the middle of like a ton of ag, and the other one was in a bunch of woods 6.5 miles away, you know, big pine country, like pine plantations, 6.5 miles away from the river. And so that deer was likely reacting to or was resulting from just an inherent need to keep safe and stay near food when it needed to. And so that might be an extreme, but maybe not. I mean, there's that Missouri example I told you of a deer going 180 miles. That's a crazy thing. I mean, I know of a dispersal, a yearling dispersal. So this is a 1.5-year-old buck in South Dakota that went like, if I remember right, like 35 miles from where it was born to set its home up. Now, I don't think that deer went back. I don't know. But I don't think that deer went back and had a multiple home range 35 miles away, but it dispersed 30 miles away from where it was born before it stopped moving and said, here is where I'm going to live.
That's crazy. Now, are there
Yeah.
states that are more likely for these deer to have, satellite home ranges, or, is it going to be, you think back to, like, you talked about Texas and, big country of Michigan, where it's just, hardwoods as far as you can see, whatever. Are those the more likely states to where these satellite home ranges are going to be? Or is it more, because I could also see it being the opposite, like, somewhere that has just incredible habitat everywhere for deer, they want to be in different places.
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if there's enough, or at least I haven't asked that question. It is a good question to the researchers doing it. And that's probably a good thing to look at, is because this is honestly, this trait that I'm mentioning really is just coming out in the last like 24 months of us understanding it a little bit better. So we're at the cutting edge, or at least, guys like Luke and others that are doing the research. I'm just sharing it with you, packaging it in a way for anybody to understand. Because when these papers come out from scientific literature, it's not written in a way for, your everyday hunter to read and understand. So what NDA does is take science, and we try to work with researchers, ask those hard questions, and then communicate it in a way for hunters to be able to utilize. That's what, one of the things that we do every year. And I don't know that answer. My guess is what you said at the end holds true, though, is that the places that have the best habitat, that are the most diverse, like the ones that affect dispersal in a positive way, where deer are not moving as far, are probably the ones where deer do it the most often. That's going to be my guess, because they would capitalize on food in different places, whereas the more homogeneous, maybe the reverse on that. I don't know. That's a really good question, Dylan. I don't know.
Here's the next
I'm not
question
afraid
for
to say
you.
I don't. I'm not afraid to say I don't know when I don't know. So I don't know.
What do you think the best state is for dispersal, and, deer having just the best habitat and everything they needs in a square, mile, and they don't have to go far? What do you think the
You mean
best state is for that?
excursions or dispersal, like where deer are moving when they're younger?
Yeah, where deer are moving when they're younger. Like the best state that offers just the best overall habitat to where deer don't have to go a long way to find that.
I would guess some of the Midwestern states probably have there's a really cool infographic that we have developed on dispersal that I can share with you in a email after this. But what it looked at, like over a dozen studies, and generally what we found is the higher percent forest cover, of the surrounding landscape, the further the dispersal. So places like Maine, New Hampshire, Upper Peninsula, Michigan, some of those bigger woods areas of the Southeast, Mississippi, Alabama, where there's nothing but pine plantations. That's where dispersals are the furthest. And so the ones that had the shortest dispersal were like Illinois, Kentucky, Iowa, because you have that interspersion, again, fancy word, but that mix of cover and food. You don't want big, wide open fields, because like you said earlier, when the harvest happens, then you have this real big open space that food can't be available. But the ones that are like, the fields are no bigger than probably 100, 150 acres on average, instead of like, 700,000 acre field sizes on average, bigger. The ones that have smaller fields, smaller woodlots, and they're all mixed up together, those are going to have the shortest dispersals.
For those of you who don't know what Matt is talking about in terms of like just thick woods, because I grew up in the South, I thought Arkansas, I thought that was like the thick woods, and then I went on a bear hunt in Maine, and it's like, dude, you want to talk about the thick, like, for the guys who say I can't shoot past 40 yards, man, because where I hunt so thick, dude, there's places in Maine you can't shoot past 4 yards. I mean, it's just insanely thick. And the whole idea, like, you don't have to worry about shooting past legal light, because you can't shoot 30 minutes before legal light. I mean, it's just, it's so dark. It's so thick. There is nothing else other than woods. It's crazy. I would encourage anybody to go and just check out the North Main Woods, because it's like, it's insanely cool.
It's a special place.
Now, what do you say to the guy? Because I have a couple properties like this. I can almost bet on not seeing bucks until the rut. Now, when the rut rolls around, those bucks are pretty well there, though. Like, you know, it's not like the one buck I'm going to see is on an excursion for that day. It's like, you know, starting October 20th, I'm going to start having the buck, and then, you know, I can see him every day, every other day. You know, he's there. Help me understand that a little bit.
I'd say that there's to the guy that's saying that to me, you're right. There's truth to that. So deer are not territorial, and a lot of hunters want to call them, you know, territorial in one way, shape, or form. With the exception, I mean, bucks and does generally segregate from each other. Bucks are together during a good chunk of the year. In bachelor groups, and then you have these doe familiar groups where they're all like related antlerless deer together, related adult does and their fawns. The majority of the year they're separate. They might be feeding in a field together, but where they're bedding is separate. And you may have a property. Oh, and going back to territorial, the only time deer are truly territorial are when fawns are being born. That's when does defend their place where they're going to give birth. And will chase other deer away from it. But to your question, you may be, to the person that's asking that question, you may have a property that is just, you may be doing such a bang up job managing it, or it's in a perfect scenario that the does have like commandeered, or, you know, basically you have a doe property, especially if it's not a very large property. And that's not a bad thing for a couple of reasons. One, does tend to get the best habitat because they're the ones giving birth. They take that fawning area and where they're feeding and hiding their fawns before bucks will get them. Not that they're having they're not having a friendly discussion or debate around the kitchen table where mom and pop are arguing with each other who's going to take that bedding area today. But does tend to have the best habitat because they're having fawns. And
now, don't get me wrong. I am asking this question because I literally have a property.
Oh, okay. So to you,
and he's gone now. But for like 4 years, I had a deer, and when he was at his biggest, I mean, we're talking 180 inches.
Yeah,
I'd never see him all year long, but I mean, I had multiple encounters with him throughout the rut on multiple years, and then, you know, starting in October, that deer would start showing up.
Yeah,
October 15th, and I'd have him through the rut, and then he'd be gone again.
That's not an excursion because those are like lasting a day or two. What you had there, Dylan, was you got a property that's bang up. It's got good habitat, and I'm guessing you're probably going to say, yeah, it is a good spot. And does are using it for most of the year, and that buck.
I might have 20 does. I might have 20 does in a picture, you know, at one time during the summer.
Oh, home ranges. There's no like going back to territorial. When you draw all of these deer on a map, and you said, if I took 20 does or 20 deer, and each one of them has their own home range, there are these overlapping circles all over the place. It's not like one deer is here and then this other one butts up to that one, and then another one butts up to that one. They obviously all interact. And so that property, I would put money on it. What you had there was a property that was ideal for does, or you have, and does use it. That buck lived within earshot, or whatever the distance was. He may have been half a mile, quarter mile, whatever it was, 1 mile away for most of the year. That was his summer home range when it was the smallest. Maybe his core area was 30 or 40 acres. His home range was about 100 acres. Your property's just outside of that. And during the summer, that's when it's small. And you go into the fall, into the rut. And again, what we said about 45 minutes ago was their home range gets bigger and bigger. And so his home range is expanding. And his home range line is going to the left or right just a little bit every month or every week. until all of a sudden you are now in his home range. And he knows that that property holds does because every fall he's there. He doesn't need to be there during the summer because he's got everything he needs over here. Yeah, he's over here. He's got his food. He's got his cover. But during the fall, now here's an interesting thing. Awesome project done by Aaron Foley. This was a Texas project again. Had studied where their home range is with, I'm sorry, I know this is going to sound confusing, where their core area is within their home range and how that changes during the rut. And so you may be picturing this whole time we're talking about, there's this big target on the map, home range, and then in the middle is core area. Well, that core area, as the home range gets bigger and bigger, that core area doesn't stay right there. It moves. And not only does it moves every week. And so they found it didn't move randomly. Those were like picked spots. And so what you had was a buck that lived nearby. His home range got bigger and his core area shifted from wherever he was to your property for probably a week or 2 or 3. And then it moved. And the real interesting thing that Aaron did was that they found that multiple bucks would have the same core area and they would basically have 2 or 3 of them hot spots within their home range. And so let's picture that buck that I'm talking about, that 180 class. His home range got bigger. You probably had him on camera every 2 to 3 days, maybe a little bit more frequently than that. And what he did was he had this focal point, that's what Aaron called him, or a hot spot, where a buck would go and visit, and he'd go to another one, and then sometimes he'd go to another one, and he would just rotate where he was going every 20 to 28 hours. And so you probably got a picture of him. Maybe he found a doe that was hot and would stay there for 2 or 3 days, but he did this. It wasn't random. Bucks don't do this randomly. They go to these spots and just bounce back and forth. And so instead of having one core area of 30 acres, they might have one over here that's 10 or 12 acres, one over here that's 5, and one over here that's 10 or 12. And they're just going back and forth constantly every 20 to 28 hours. Does that sound familiar? Is that how often you got pictures of them?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
so that's what that buck was doing. He was basically keying in on and getting ready for doe receptiveness, and would just revisit it and check in every couple hours or 20 hours.
I don't mean to be simple here, but I also like to think about deer simply.
Yeah.
A lot of these things are like, what? That's mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
But just think about it in terms of people. Like, everything that you're saying is true for people too.
It is.
We go on excursions. we go on vacations. When a deer is looking for a female, or when a guy is looking for a female, he's not picking any random old places. He's going to the bars. He's going to the clubs. He's going to where females are. It's not random. He's going to where the women are. I mean, everything we've talked
about.
That's true. A deer, like, when I was young and wild, I went everywhere. I was crazy. Now I like to pretty much stay home with the wife and kids. Like, my home range has shrunk. I mean, it's just everything we're talking about. If you think about it, it's like, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, I try
they're
to
mammals
tell people,
too.
Yeah, I try to tell people
they're
all the
mammals
time,
too,
like,
and they're here on Earth for a couple reasons. It's the same reasons we're here.
Yeah. Like, and I tell people, I'm like, don't overcomplicate it. Like, if you think about deer in terms of us, it becomes really simple. They want shelter to be safe. They want food, and they want sex. That's pretty much what I live for, Matt. I don't know about you, but that's pretty much
what I live for.
What I'm here for. And different times of the year are, different things. And you say, what do you mean by that? Well, I mean, during the winter, I want to be sheltered down where it's nice and warm in my house. I mean, everything that we're talking about here. And I tell people like this too. They're like, well, I don't understand. When do they start changing? And I'm like, well, think about it, dude. If you get done with a hard workout, what do you want to do? You want to go eat. You want to replenish everything you just burned. Same is true with a deer. Dude, they've had a month-long workout of chasing does around, and they've depleted every bit of energy stores they have. They want to start hitting the food again and rebuilding that back up. And that's why, for me, late season's my favorite time, because I can bank on the deer being at that food right then.
That is really good. I mean, honestly, that's super perceptive and a good way to look at it. And I think of deer and like people in other ways too, which makes it, some people might say that are non-hunters, how can you even hunt them when you think of them like this? But it's not hard at all. I mean, you and I know that. But aging deer on the hoof, the older a buck gets, the bigger its pot belly gets, the more wrinkles it gets, the more
100%.
scars it gets,
the grumpier
that's like
he
people
gets.
too. The grumpier it gets, their personality, their movements. There is a lot of overlap to us. And all that said, going back to the beginning of the conversation, these are things that we know. I mean, there are some absolute truths in the deer movement world. I can promise you that their home range for an individual deer during the rut is going to be bigger than it is during the summer. I can promise you, and you could put money on the fact that deer are most active at dawn and dusk. I wrote an article for our website here, I guess it was last year, about the two most predictable times to see deer are dawn and dusk. And study after study after study have shown these peaks in deer movement around that time. It's because of the way they're built, their physiology, their eyesight, the way they feed and they gorge. They're like a cow. They have a 4-chambered stomach like a cow. They're a ruminant, so they gorged on food and then they retreat into security. And so they're going to do that when predators are least active and least likely to be able to kill them, like us, like other, 4-legged predators. And so that's a truth. I know that deer are most active at dawn and dusk. But all that said, I mean, I come up empty-handed some seasons. It's frustrating as heck. There is no absolute silver bullet. There's no app on my phone that I can download or purchase that tells me, stand here, go hunting now, you're going to shoot a deer. It doesn't exist.
Now, I just checked the math before I said this, but this whole thing that you're talking about, dispersal, that's new for me. I've never heard that before. However, again, if we think about the human life, it's about the same. 20% of your life is spent with mama, and then you move on out to go find your own place to live. We move out at 18, they move out at a year and a half. I mean, that's about 20% of their life. 24% of their life. And they're gone, and it's time to move.
I tell hunters regarding dispersal, yearling bucks are easy to kill for a couple of reasons. One of them is dispersal. People don't think of it like this, but they, that is when they're moving. It's between anywhere between 12 and 18 months of age, which is when they're 1.5. And the majority happens in the fall. Most of the dispersal is happening right now as we talk on October 4th and recording this. The past couple of weeks and the next couple of weeks. Some of it happens in the spring when fawns are born, about a quarter of it, but the vast majority of it is happening now. And so when you're out there with a bow or gun, but when you're out there hunting and you see a spike or forky or, a young buck, one that is only 1.5 years old based on its body and its antlers, there's a pretty good chance that's the first time that buck has been on that property because he just dispersed. Or was just got there within the next, the last week or two. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's also feeling testosterone for the first time, thinking about when we're 18, right? Talking about when you get out of home. So he's fueled with testosterone, a hormone that has never been in his system at that level. And he's away at college. He's on ground he's never walked on. So they look dumb because they don't know what they're doing. They're walking around. Yeah, they are. And so that is a movement that puts them they're at major vulnerability for getting shot because of those reasons.
On the flip side of that coin, if I've got a spike buck all summer long and it comes to about this time, I can almost bet he's going to be leaving. He's going to go find his place to live.
Yes. There's a very good chance.
So
yes.
Interesting, dude.
But you'll probably get one from somewhere else. And so if a lot of, quote, I'm going to air quote here, your yearling bucks are small antlered yearlings, spikes, small spikes, instead of having a branched antler, you may immediately be thinking, as I say that, well, that's my neighbor's problem. My neighbor's not raising good ground or doesn't have good habitat, and they're sending me bad, poor antler growth young deer. But it's probably a neighborhood issue. It's probably not just what one neighbor is doing. It's probably the general area, and you can manage around that. You can definitely manage around that. And so you will have a wide variety, a bell-shaped curve, if you will, of antler quality at different ages. You're going to have some really small antlered deer at one particular age class and some above average. But if your average yearling is got some kind of branched antler, that's actually a good sign. It doesn't need to be big, but if it has at least a 3 or 4 pointer, talking about from the eastern perspective, a branched antler, that's a sign that you have good habitat. Otherwise, most will be spikes.
Now, but going back, just because it's a spike doesn't mean, he's never going to be a stud. I mean, there's been studies shown.
No.
There's been studies shown, and some were high fence, some were not, but still, it doesn't matter. Of spike bucks blowing up into giant deer. I mean,
yes,
it happens.
They can grow into trophy quality deer. They can be a deer of your dreams. They're not going to stay a spike. That has been proven. There is evidence that if you took, let's say you're in Kansas, one county in Kansas, and then another county on the other side of the state, north, south, east, west, doesn't matter. But one's in a better area than the other. And you took the yearling bucks off of this one neighborhood, and they all had spikes, or majority had spikes, and this other one had generally 4 pointers. On average, the deer that start with branched antlers will be larger by about 10% than the ones that started at spikes. So they do stay separate throughout their life.
Right.
Something that's born with branch antlers tends to be bigger on average than the ones that start with spikes. But they both, you might be talking a difference of 147-inch deer that was a spike at 3 or 4 versus 155-inch deer that was, at 3 or 4 years old. It's not a giant difference in antler quality, but there is a difference. And that all starts from where they're born, and actually starts 2 generations before that, just to kind of not to chase a rabbit here, but there was this awesome study done in Mississippi. I think it was was it Mike Cherry did the research, or Eric Michael? I can't remember who did it. One of those 2 researchers. It was known as epigenetics research, where they took a doe from poor habitat, brought it into captivity, fed it amazing food, let it have a fawn, fed it amazing food the next year, let it have a fawn, and then followed those fawns from the first 2 generations throughout its life. And then the 3rd year kept feeding that doe amazing food. They found there was a lag effect of about 3 years, 2 to 3 years, where even though that doe was taken from poor ground and given food for a season and had really good health for that year, the fawn that was born that first or second season tended to be small, stunted, because there was this genetic lag effect called epigenetics. It took a couple of generations of her eating food, good food, for it to change. And so I say all that, that's not having anything to do with movement, other than if you do your work on the ground and do habitat work, don't expect immediate results. You got to stay with it. I guess that's what I'm saying. And your neighbors have to stay with it. And you need to fundamentally raise the bar of food and cover for multiple years, and then the deer will catch up with you.
Right. And that's what, so many guys, they don't look at their hunting properties long term. And I mean, even long term, planting fruit trees that you're not going to benefit from for however many years,
Yeah.
planting, acorns that you're not going to see you might not even see in your lifetime, but you're benefiting those deer for the long term. Yeah, but so many people want to start running a protein system or a food plot system, and next year, dude, I'm gonna kill a giant because I put in a food plot. Well, no, it's gonna take you a few years, to reap
Yeah.
those benefits. You mentioned hunting pressure. How does hunting pressure? And here's how do I want to word this? How long does it take me? I've burned the biggest deer of my life. He was at 40 yards. The wind switches. He pinpoints me in a tree, looks right at me, and bounces away. How long until I can kill that deer again?
That's a great question. And I love that we're talking about hunting pressure because that's what we all, I'm not going to say care about, but obviously it's a main driver of why probably people are listening to this is want to know where deer go at certain times. Management certainly plays a part of it too.
To tell you the truth, the hunting pressure is one of the largest reasons I don't hunt in the early season. Not because, it's hot and miserable, but at the same time, again, think about it. I'm producing more sweat, more odor. The deer can smell better than ever. I'm just creating pressure that really is just not going to do me any good and just cause harm for the long term. So I'd rather just wait until conditions are right. I'd rather wait until I'm producing less scent. They're having a harder time smelling. They're moving more, and they're coming, to where I need to kill them. So anyway, sorry, go ahead. But after I've burned that deer, how long do I got to wait?
Well, 3 days. I'll get right to the heart of it. We all know or feel like deer react to hunting pressure. Up until a couple years ago, we really didn't know. But there's been there's been a pile of studies that have looked at hunting pressure, and they all kind of generally agree with yes, it exists. When we enter the woods by smell, sound, even this one cool project put out a recording device with no human out there, but it played human voices and was able to measure a reaction of deer movement in front of cameras and general deer movement. So just human voice, smell, our presence, deer react to us being out there, going back to the October lull thing that we talked about earlier. So yes, it happens. They react immediately. Within 12 hours, deer change what they're doing. So you can imagine within a 12-hour time period, deer may be interacting with your scent, not much. It's probably the first time they interact with your presence. And it takes them 2 to 3 days to return to normal. The good news is they do return to normal. They go back to what they were doing. Generally, they probably change their path that they're using. But if they're feeding in a general area of your farm or, bedding in a certain place of your property or neighbor's property, they will continue. They will go back to doing those general things. But the path they take, the time that they move changes. But it takes a couple days to return to normal. And there have been studies in Auburn University. Kevin Wiskirchen did one. In North Carolina, Clint McCoy did a study. He's actually now works in Ohio for the state agency. Kevin works in Missouri. There was a study in Oklahoma. Noble Foundation did. There was one in Maryland on Chesapeake Farms. Study after study that had collars on it showed that deer reacted. They react quickly, and it takes them about 3 days to return to normal.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here.
Just kind of, sure.
Because earlier you mentioned deer having memory, and they remember, and I'm not going to go there no more. Now, I think what you were talking about was, those types of excursions. Like, okay, I went over there, and something bad happened, so I'm not going to go back over there. Whereas when something bad happens in their home range, that doesn't mean, okay, I got to go find a new home. I got to move completely. Is that kind of where the difference lies?
I think, but I also think there's a continuum of risk, right? Like, let's say you have
Yeah.
a 750 acre home range of a
Okay.
buck, and that buck cuts your scent, but doesn't get shot at. That deer will probably return to what he was doing. It may not use the same trail system. In fact, there's a fancy word for it, but multiple studies showed they actually took longer to get places and use more complex paths to get from A to B once they responded, but they still went back to what they were doing. However, if you shot at and hit that deer through its backstrap, that deer's probably never going back. I'm not saying
To that point.
100% certain, because we've all seen a buck get wounded or heard stories about it, and then that hunter kills that deer out of that same stand. In all likelihood, that deer is doing that and making a major mistake because he's chasing a doe or something else that he is not paying attention to what he was doing. But what I'm saying is, as a buck ages, if you got old Grandpappy's stand, in the same corner of your farm that your grandfather used and your dad used and you use, and that buck gets close to being killed at it when he's one, if he, let's say he's one or two or three, couple different times, I think he's going to carve that corner of the farm out and say, I'm not going over there. His home range has effect gotten smaller because he's not
Yeah.
going to that spot where that permanent stand is. However, if he's walking a trail and you're in a climber and the wind shifts and he cuts your scent stream and he's like, whoa, backs out of there, but never really is at like real risk of getting killed, that deer's probably going to use that same part of the farm again until he dies or you miss him or, wound him or something like that. And so I think there's a continuum of use that is happening. And so generally, if you were going to shade the map out of places where are super high risk, bucks don't live that long. You know that. I mean, 5 is really old. And so after a couple seasons, you shade out or X out the areas of the home range that the deer was using at 2, it is shrinking. It's shrinking. But the best food is available over here, and they're not getting shot at or, at major risk for going over there. They're going to continue going over there. They're just going to figure out a different time to do it. They'll do it at night. They'll use a trail over here. They'll go way out of their way to go over to it, but they do change what they're doing.
Yeah. Now, last year, dude, crazy story. I was in Missouri and I shooted a deer and I missed low. And I never found the arrow. So I thought I just clean miss. I never found the arrow. The arrow's buried in the dirt, whatever. Or the arrow skipped a mile. I never found the arrow. I thought it was a clean miss. And the very next morning, that deer comes back in. And I'm like, well, it doesn't know what happened. It has no idea. It just, something made a noise and it ran off. I shoot the deer and kill it. And when I go up to him, I'm like, what is that? Turns out right underneath his belly, the blade of my broadhead just sliced right underneath his, right behind his back legs, just, and I'm talking a very clean cut just underneath his brisket, like didn't even bleed at all. I mean, and I was just like, that
just skin deep or meat deep.
Meat deep, yeah. And I was like,
yeah.
He came back the next day.
What week was it?
December 6th, 7th, somewhere in there.
What was he driving him? Food at that time?
Oh,
of year?
it had
Did
to
he
be.
have to come there to eat?
Yeah.
That pull of needing to eat, that is a little surprising. But
again, it was such a clean cut. Like it was such a it wasn't limping, wasn't. I mean, that deer never would have. He would have lived 100 more. 100 more encounters. Who knows? He would have.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just sure enough, the very next day,
it was just a mosquito bite. It was a mosquito bite to him. I mean,
it really
they also
was,
have crazy pain thresholds.
And you
their
think
threshold
about it,
for pain is just insane.
I thought about it too. I'm like, well, if he was to get hit by a barbed wire fence, it would be there because that's where he's jumping over, and if he was to, and so, yeah, I mean, he was probably hurting a little bit. I mean, he probably felt it, but he probably didn't tie it back to that noise I heard. And, in my mind thinking. So anyways, now I thought about it like this too, going back to how just because a deer is spooked doesn't mean he's never going back to that point again. If that was the case, I mean, think about how many times a coyote spooks a deer. If they were never to go back every time they got spooked, Lord, they wouldn't have anywhere to live because coyotes are everywhere. Now, I do think there's a big difference. And, dude, you can tell me I'm an idiot if not. I don't, this is just bro science, I guess. But I had a conversation with Justin Spring from the Boone and Crockett Club, and we were talking about, kind of that predator mentality. And kind of how, in the summertime when you're walking in the woods and you're checking cameras and a deer sees you, just kind of trots off. It knows you're not hunting almost. Whereas, when you're in that kill mode, when you're in that, I want to kill anything I see, I just need to kill a deer, and you get busted, that deer bolts, it's gone. Same with a coyote that just trots by, not messing with the deer don't even hardly look at it. Whereas when a coyote is sneaking up on them quiet and stealthy like he wants to kill a fawn, the deer bolt. So deer almost have that sense. You're almost putting off that, I don't know if it's pheromones, I don't even know what to call it, but you're putting off that predator vibe, you know what I mean? And deer can tell that difference. Why a farmer walking through the field doesn't freak deer out. They just kind of trot off and look at him, Is that,
I think
is
that's
there
seasonal
any kind
too.
of,
I mean, there's no science behind that, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
yeah.
In my experience, just anecdotally, I mean, you can't measure their reaction based on, what they're thinking, but, in my experience, just being a hunter myself, is that those interactions where they are less likely to flee are seasonal. They're definitely, times of the year where they're not getting pressured by people, and there are times of the year where we're in the woods more, and so I think the prevalence of those reactions where a deer just doesn't care are greatest when it's spring, summer. This is just my thought on it, and the prevalence of the get the heck out of Dodge reaction is going to be greater in the fall, with the exception of the rut, because during the rut, they don't have their faculties, does or bucks. They're not really paying attention to anything at that point other than the need to breed. I mean, that's what they both need to do to procreate and pass on their genes and have more offspring, and that's what we're built to do. Thinking about risk or opportunity, bringing it back to the human comparison, I guess. If you were that buck, but you're, put yourself in a human shoes, which we are. If you were starving, homeless, and there was no food around, but there was like one place you could get food, and you were at your wit's end to find food that time of year, and you realize that you had to cross a real busy street, you might get hit by a car. How badly are you going to cross that street to get over there to get that, plate of food? That's what that buck was doing. I think he was driven by food more than anything else. It needed food at that time of year because it was driven by that. I guess on the flip side, though, on the opportunity, when you were younger and you went to a bar, let's say you got a girl's number or more so one time, and then you strike out weekend after weekend after weekend at that same bar, you're going to remember the time that you scored a phone number or more. And so you're probably going to continue going to that bar. So, opportunity or risk drives behavior for sure. What deer are, that sixth sense? I don't know how to measure that. I'm sure there is truth to it, but my gut tells me professionally and personally that's seasonal, and that they build up a tolerance for it and then it goes down.
Gotcha. Yeah, and it all makes sense too. I just think because there are those times where, there are days where you're like, I'm just going to go out and sit and see, I'm just going to have a good time. And there are days when you're just in that absolute, I want to kill something mode. And it seems like on those days where you're just like hyper focused and you want to kill a deer so bad that it's almost when those times the deer get more spooked. And I don't know. I mean, you know, you just think about it like that and you're like, can deer recognize that I am in like this predator mode? And can they recognize like when we're out to just have a good time and sit and watch them, and maybe if a giant walks by, we'll shoot them. But you know, it's almost like, I don't know, because when you decide, all right, I'm going to kill some does, then the does don't come in, you know, because
it's probably truer with that group of deer than anything else, right?
Yeah, for sure. Now, part of me wants to dive into weather and moon phases. Part of me wants to save it for a part B episode. But I do, you know, I think we're getting right to that point in season where, you know, people want to start looking at forecast and figuring out, well, what should determine when I go hunt. So in your opinion, what's the single biggest factor of the weather that plays a role on deer movement?
All right, I think we can't do a part B. You can't leave anybody hanging. We got to talk about this stuff right now. So let's talk about weather first. All right, so weather is a complex beast in the deer movement arena of research. There is a lot of disagreement in the researcher community, in the science, and the published literature, that it either impacts it or it doesn't. It's kind of an inconclusive, from a research standpoint, an inconclusive result. There are projects, I mean, I can give you dozens of projects that show that had either old radio collars on deer or GPS collars, the newer ones that have a GPS unit in them, that show there were small influences in wind velocity, wind direction, barometric pressure, those kinds of things, small influences that change deer movement. But there is as much, if not more, projects with both radio collars and GPS collars that show no effect, no impact. Whether, I mean, I'm talking about studies that had 500,000 data points, you know, deer that have collars on them for months, collecting them every hour and comparing it with weather data and showing no influence at all. Bucks, does, both, you know, all ages, and seeing a cold front, knowing like the timing, you know, whatever, October 7th coming up, we're supposed to have a cold front coming through later this week here in the Northeast, and watching deer movement on a daily basis, how much they're moving, cold front comes through and deer not moving any different multiple times throughout the season. So that's the research side of it. And I don't do this often, but the hunter in me feels differently, as it does probably every person listening here to this, that weather has to play a part, right? It's just, I don't think it's been, not that I don't think, it has not been shown in the research. I want it to be there and say inconclusively or conclusively, yes, we know weather affects deer movement, but it just doesn't show up. But, you know, in my soul, I feel like weather does impact it. Certainly wind direction, is going to have probably the largest play on it, because deer live and die by a couple of their senses. Their eyesight isn't great compared to us. Their sense of hearing is not better than ours. I think we've talked about this on this podcast before, their senses. But what their best line of defense is their nose, is their their sense of smell. And so wind, as any bow hunter knows, thermals rising, falling, but directional wind carries your scent, and everybody that hunts has seen deer pick up your scent, and that is going to play a role in it. Cold fronts, I sigh. You probably could hear me sighing. Do cold fronts impact deer movement?
Yes.
I mean, I can show you graphs, Dylan, that show collared deer not changing to cold fronts coming through. I can.
I don't believe them.
Temperature. So temperature as a variable, temperature is one that I don't think has shown any, other than extreme cases where you have like a major weather event like a hurricane that had wind and temperature changes where deer stop what they're doing, or a major winter storm, but like a 10-degree difference or barometric change, we haven't seen it, or at least it hasn't been picked up in the research. Now I'm going to talk. We're looking eye to eye on the screen right now. I'm going to tell you from a hunter, I do like to hunt cold fronts. I do like to hunt when the weather changes because I do think that they feel differently.
But there is no scientific data to prove.
No, not a direct temperature change. Yeah, no. If you type in a Google search that says cold fronts, what happens to deer? I mean, we all think that. But
see, I've never had to Google that.
Not on the GPS research.
Yeah. You don't even think about Googling that because like they move more. Yeah. They're going to be up and about.
No, it could be. It could, and I might be grasping here. It could be that it just hasn't been measured, but I don't know of a study that shows a cold front direct influence deer change what they're doing.
Okay, here's another scenario for you. The closer it gets to rut, does it play more of a difference because it's pushing them more into breeding? Like if I have a cold front on October 20th, I can almost, I'm going to be there because those bucks that I talked about not coming in until, the rut, they start coming in. Is it because it pushes them a little closer to, wanting to cuddle up next to a woman?
Yeah, no. I mean, the stuff I've seen has been done peak rut, post rut, pre rut, summer, like different times a year. Yeah.
I can't wait to just go about making I can't wait to go about making everybody mad when they talk about the cold front. I'm like, there's no scientific data to prove that, right?
There isn't. I mean, so that's on the data side. So on the data side, talking about what's the science show, wind direction, wind velocity, a little bit of barometric pressure. And then extreme temperatures. Extreme temperatures are where the science shows a little bit of a difference. But a cold, like specifically looking at a cold front where the temperature drops down, decreases in temperature. No, I have not seen data that says a cold front makes deer do something different.
Okay,
that doesn't mean it does. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just I haven't seen the science behind it.
I've got a couple questions about the wind, but before that, I had always said temperature plays a difference and barometric pressure plays a difference. And when you get those two both complementing each other in terms of you've got a dropping temperature and a rising thermal and they're meeting, you've got rising thermals and dropping temperatures, those two complement each other, and that's the time you need to be in the woods. Now, do temperatures make a difference? Yes. Do barometric pressures make a difference? Yes. But when they're meeting, it complements each other, and almost both of those are magnified to increase deer movement, and that's the best time to hunt. So you're telling me everything I've ever known in my life was a lie?
No, I'm not saying that. The science hasn't shown it, and I would say to anybody, because I do it, maybe I'm just trying to make myself feel better, but pretty much anybody I know, even the researchers, still try to hunt.
Fronts.
Hunt opportunistically on weather changes. And if that's the thing that is getting us out there, it doesn't matter what the reason is. Even if the science isn't showing it. I mean, you just said earlier, and I agree with this, it's hard to hunt early season, right? Because it's so darn hot out. But deer are on their feet early season, and they're predictable, and you can kill them if you got your butt out there. Same thing with the rut. If you're using a cold front as your excuse to go sit and actually spend time in the stand, if that increases your success, it doesn't really matter. But if you want the data to show it, to keep you there, it doesn't exist. But I'd say don't worry about it. Just get your butt out there and go hunt when you need to.
Man.
I'm shrugging my shoulders. I don't know what to tell you. That's what the data shows.
It does. It gives you a lot to think about. And I'm sitting here trying to think of an argument for you to be like, oh yeah, you're right. And I can't. I just don't, you think about, well, deer move more at night because it's cooler. So then when it cools off, they'll move during the day because it's cooler. Or, but I do think a lot of this, man, I think a lot of this comes down to time. And your first cold front happens at when the rut is starting to fire up. And so that's the first time dudes like, oh, there's a first cold front of the year. Well, it's October 30th. Whether it's a cold front or not, they're going to start moving more. You know what I mean? It's like you said, though, that just happens to get them out there.
It does, and I don't think that's going to die. That thought process in the hunting culture, no matter how much we try to explain it, it's cultural. It is endemic. It is part of what hunters think. And so, it's not the worst thing in the world to have some motivation to go out and hunt. You could think of it one of two ways, going back to the hunting pressure thought process. You may want to be the person out there to take advantage of the fact that deer are getting moved around. Or you may want to be the one that when a cold front comes through in late October, wait 3 days, because that's when all these guys are out of the woods, guys and gals, and deer are starting to return to normal, and try to take advantage of that. Or if
I
you can
do
hunt
think I
both
heard.
Times.
I think it was Mark Drury that said his favorite time to hunt is 3 days after a cold front. For that very reason, because dudes have went in and boogered them up, and 3 days after they calm back down, and that's when he kills them. I think it was Mark Drury.
We had a popular article on our website years ago that said something. The title of it was like, the best day to hunt is a Thursday or something like that, because people hunt on Saturdays and, go in the woods Saturday, Sunday, they go back to their job. You got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, deer kind of like returning to normal. Wednesday afternoon, Thursday morning for a morning sit is a good day to be out there, by and large. And it holds
true. A lot
true.
of truth to that.
Yeah.
Now, we're sitting here right now on a Wednesday morning, and because of a cold front, I rewrote my schedule for the week. I was supposed to be at my Oklahoma place Monday through Wednesday, and the cold front, I looked and I have a cold front coming in Thursday, so I'm like, never mind, I'll hold out and I'll go Thursday through Saturday rather than. So I rewrote my whole
I'm doing
week
the same thing. I'm doing the same thing, and I know the data. I'm gonna hunt when it gets cooler out, because it was like, I don't remember. We had a record here in my state yesterday. It wasn't like crazy warm, but it was record for October 3rd, and it's supposed to be warm today, and it's going to get cooler tomorrow afternoon. And I've been watching the weather. I watch wind direction, wind speed. Obviously, if it's super windy, that's a little hard to shoot a bow. Rain, and temperature. I pay attention to all that stuff too. So you could take, whatever you want with a grain of salt from this guy who's got a biologist degree and job and knows the science. I still try to hunt when the weather is advantageous to be out there, and maybe it's all in my head, but I'm doing the same thing.
Now, before I still got a couple questions about wind, but give like barometric pressure 101 to that person who's like, well, you got wind direction and barometric pressure. How do they play a role? How do they give that 101 barometric pressure?
I don't think I can do that. I don't think I can do that. Do you think you could do that?
No. We're gonna get. I don't think I can do that.
Yeah, I'm not a weatherman. I'm a deer biologist and forester.
So barometric pressure.
I just know it's something that's measured. Yeah.
Generally, they rise in the morning and they fall in the evening. So what your pressure is it's going to be carrying your scent along with the wind. So if I've got a wind blowing to the north with a rising pressure, then that means my wind is going to be going north and up, my scent. Whereas if I've got a south wind with dropping barometric pressures, it's going to be blowing into the south and blowing to the ground. Now, I want to have somebody on who knows a whole lot about barometric pressure, because I've oftentimes wondered, how high does it carry my scent? Like if I'm 20 feet up in a tree.
Where's the threshold where wind will beat barometric pressure, or where's the threshold? This is the stuff I really don't know. Like the wind direction and wind speed, what's it take for that to actually overcome barometric pressure, where that is the major influence? I don't know those things.
Yeah. We're going to have somebody on. Stay tuned, because I'm going to have somebody on that just is a weatherman and can tell us all
Good.
about barometric pressure. But I've just wondered that. I'm like, okay, well, if I'm 20 feet up in the stand and I've got, a 32 barometric pressure, how high does it really truly carry my scent? Or is it just like it floats up a little bit and then drops right back down? I've wondered that, like how much can I get away with, if you will, or if there's dropping pressure, how tight is it going to pack my scent to the ground, or does it just hit and then disperse back up into the air? I just wondered that. So, what wind speeds have you found? And just so you know, that one of the podcasts I mentioned that I have saved and I listen to every year, is Mark Drury talking about this very topic. What wind directions and speeds have you found to be the best for deer movement?
I think they vary based on the landscape. Obviously, the more open it is versus the more cover and terrain there is. And I may be off on this, but I think 7 to 10 miles an hour stand out, but I can't think of any cardinal direction. I think it varies. Obviously there's some inherent basic directions that wind will go. But I don't know that answer actually. But it's that kind of mid speed, I think, is where the threshold is.
Yeah, for sure. I do think, Mark said, and his was all bro science of what he's found over the years, but I think he said 7 to 13 is what he's like. I'm going to be in the woods. If it's anything less than that, then my scent's kind of just, floating around in the area. And if it's anything more than that, then it just becomes hard to hunt. So, but I think you're right. That 7, 13 miles per hour. Now
that sounds right. I mean, and he's obviously a very accomplished hunter and probably keeps track of all this stuff. So that sounds right to me. The stuff that I've seen is where you have a very consistent, moderate wind speed is where it probably has the most predictability.
Right. Because, I mean, if you think about it, again, when it's consistent and when it's moderate, that's when the deer can best use their noses. Whereas if it's ripping the wind through there, they can't use their nose. And if it's just kind of swirling all the time, they can't use their nose. So a consistent mid-level speed is when a deer can best use their nose. And that's when you can, get in there and use the wind to your advantage and kill them.
Yeah.
All right. Now on to the real thing that causes division here. Moon. Does the moon play a role on deer movement?
100% it does not affect deer movement. I hate to burst anybody's bubbles, but there is dozens of studies that have looked at this. I can send you the papers.
Okay, listen. Let me give you my argument first before you give me the scientific garbage. Let me give you my argument first. For the last 15 years, I was 100%. Yeah, it doesn't play any kind of role. They're going to move when they move, no matter what. However, I started thinking about this about 4 years ago, and I thought, okay, if the moon plays the biggest role in the ocean and its tides, and we as mammals are made up of water, then how would it not determine how we feel, how we act, what we do? And I don't know if there are scientific studies by any means, but there's a lot of articles that show kids don't sleep well at night during a full moon, and they're going to act psychopaths during the day when there's a full moon the night before, all those types of things. And kids with special needs are more affected, and they, go bonkers based off of moons. And so I'm like, okay, well, if they say the moon affects us as people, how would it not affect the deer? And so I just started thinking and I'm not the one that's going to say, oh yeah, dude, full moon, new moon, you got to be out there hunting, bro. It's not what I'm saying, because I don't know how it affects them. But in my mind, I'm like, okay, if it affects the ocean tide and it affects us as people, how would it not affect the deer? I don't know how it affects them, but how would it not affect the deer? You know what I mean?
I do, and so it's funny you said that because I've thought about that on the human side too. And let's talk about photoperiod too, which let me jump to second. What photoperiod is and how that drives deer behavior, and it's a major driver in deer physiology and behavior. But I've never read anything personally, and I know that myself, when there is different things going on with the moon, I don't feel it. I don't feel differences in my sleep. That doesn't mean there's nothing happening and there's articles out there. But for folks listening, if you feel differently when there's a new moon versus a full moon, and you're documenting it and not documenting it, maybe there's truth to it. But I don't know of anything on the human side. And we keep going back to comparing humans to deer in this podcast. And so I would say on the flip side, if it doesn't impact us, or at least it doesn't show, I don't know of anything conclusive that shows moons affect human personality, behavior, moods, those kinds of things, but maybe it exists. I just don't know of any. And then what photoperiod is, to be argumentative or defend how could moon phases not impact deer. Here, this is something scientific that we absolutely know. Photoperiod is the amount of daylight in a 24-hour period. This is why we have to change our clocks twice a year, is the way the earth is tilted towards the sun or not. The amount of hours of light shining on this earth change. And that drives deer behavior. It drives deer physiology, impacts antler growth, testosterone production, breeding, just so many things about deer physiology. I mean, honestly, they've even you can't really do this anymore, but they've used deer in captivity and grown multiple sets of antlers in a year on a deer by messing with photoperiod, by keeping the deer in a place where the deer thinks it goes through 2 years in a one calendar year. It grows, sheds, and regrows antlers and sheds more than one set a year based on photoperiod. So we know, that is not,
wow.
That is not a question. Photoperiod drives a lot of things in the deer world. Photoperiod is what drives the stuff you're talking about with tides and other animals and other things too. It's photoperiod. And so the whole moon theory is based on the fact that we know that what the amount of light in a 24-hour period affects animals, affects deer. How could, when a moon is changing throughout a month, going brighter and then darker, how could that not add to photoperiod, right? If they're getting on a bright full moon all that extra light, and on a new moon all the less of it, how could that not drive it? And so the theory is based on that, and that makes 100% sense to me and every other researcher. And there have been researchers that have taken not only moon phase, so, full moon, quarter moon, new moon, all this stuff, but actually put out devices on study sites that measured ambient light coming from the moon. Because think about it, you may have a full moon. I don't know if there's a full moon tonight or not, but let's say there is tonight. But it's cloudy and stormy for the next week. Even though the phase of the moon is full, you're not getting all that light to the ground, right? Because it's cloudy. On the flip side, you might have a really cloudy month in the next, or a really cloudy couple weeks, and then you have a couple weeks in a row of really clear skies, and the moon is not full, but it's on the on the downward side, or I can't remember all the terms of the moon phases, but it's supposed to be a darker moon, but you're getting more light. So ambient light at that time of the month might be brighter than it was when it was a full moon. So researchers have even done that, where they put out weather stations and ambient meters or light meters to measure on a study site, and they had collared deer, GPS collared deer, to see if whether or not deer movement is changing over this. There have been even researchers that have gone beyond deer movement. I mean, the deer movement stuff has existed, where they charted full moons, new moons, over falls. Mississippi State has a great infographic about this that I can share with you. But going beyond that and actually looking at breeding, physical copulation events, breeding events that turned into a sperm meets egg, a fawn was conceived, and charted that over like a decade plus. There was a study, really well-known study, where they looked from like, it was like 1995 to 2007. It was like 12 years long, where they charted new moon versus full moon every year. And then they actually charted conceptions, knowing exactly when deer were conceived based on this fetal scale that was developed a long time ago, and not seeing correlation there, where, 1 year you might have a new moon during the peak of the rut, 1 year you might have a full moon. Anyway, long story short, I'm telling you, I can give you literature, reams of literature that say no effect, not statistically significant, no impact. In fact, one study said it had an opposite effect than what the researchers thought, the opposite of their hypothesis. I have not seen one thing, one iota, one shred of evidence in the deer movement research that shows moon phase or the amount of light from a moon impacts deer movement or deer breeding. I don't know what to say other than that, but it's been disproven like over a dozen times.
No, and I know it's been disproven. And again, my response to the guys that say, well, Dylan, it's been disproven. That is my only response of like, well, and I know, and I can't tell you how it affects them. I don't look for a certain moon to go hunting. I just have to think it does affect them somehow. That's my only response.
It's the same thing with the weather, right?
Yeah. Like which, and I don't know. It's one of those things where in my mind, I'm like, it has to affect them to some extent, but nothing about the moon determines when I'm going to go hunt or not. Like nothing about it. It might affect.
There you go.
It might affect how and when I get to and from my stand, because if it's a really bright night, I might change that up a little bit. But that's all just bro science and hypotheticals that have happened over my lifetime. So, what are you going to do?
Going back to the beginning of the podcast, these are all great things to know about deer movement. I mean, we all know that they move most at dawn and dusk. You may not have known that they went on excursions, but you probably did know in your heart of hearts, deep inside, you were like, oh man, why'd that buck get killed way over there? All this stuff that we just went over. It's good to know all this stuff, and try to play the odds the best you possibly can. Like hunt, be out there early before it gets light out because they're most active at dawn, and get out there early afternoon. Don't be walking out just as sun sets because that's when they're most active. There are some basic things that we do as hunters that we know about deer movement, but I would say and recommend, there is no automatic that will tell you over how to get out and kill a deer on a specific scenario. But there are some things that we do know, like dawn and dusk, or hunt early season or late season, although it might be hard to do it because it's super hot or super cold, that you already know that's when your best shot at killing the deer is to be predicted. I shouldn't say best shot to kill a deer, but they're most predictable at that time of year. And you also know that in the rut, deer are running around like crazy during times when you can kill deer, like middle of the day, because they're trying to breed. And so most of us probably already have these things in mind when we go hunting. Maybe you'll alter your hunting style a little bit with some of this information, but it is good to know, one, to understand them better. And if we know our quarry better, if we understand the species better, we can not only appreciate them better, it does put us in a situation to be successful more frequently than not knowing, right? Like if you had no idea, like you were a brand new hunter, you didn't even know that they were active at dawn and dusk. You just bought your license and you're going out for the first time. you'd be starting at ground zero. Like you would have no idea. And you're more like, you could get lucky, but you're more likely to be unsuccessful than somebody that's gone through trial and error and knows the things that happen that work well and knows the things that don't work well. And that might come with wind direction or wind speed or moon phase even. And so use the things that you know to make yourself successful, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure. So the only daily factor, outside of late season, early season, the rut, the only daily factor that really determines if you should go hunting on this day or not is wind. Correct? I mean, are we safe
and
to say that?
Time of day. And time of day.
And
unless
wind.
you're talking specifically about weather. Yeah, I mean, time of day, deer are going to be most active the hour and a half to 2 hours around dawn, and the same probably a little bit longer around dusk. Every day, no matter what time of year it is. And then wind is another thing I would take into consideration, but less so than the time of year. The biggest thing would be time of day. The second biggest would be time of year. Those are the two things that I think about, and then wind.
There you go. So your best, if I could paint this picture for you, the very best time you can kill a deer is either early season. So we're talking, August 17th, whenever your season opens, August 17th or December 17th. Early season or late season, in the morning or evening, which that's, like you said, unless you're a brand new hunter, most people know that. Morning or evening with a steady medium 10-mile-an-hour wind in any direction, but it's a steady, constant wind. That is your perfect scenario right there.
You just don't hunt downwind of where you expect deer to show up, right? So, yeah, that is it. I mean, and then you do all that, and then what happens, Dylan? Are you going to see and kill deer every time you go?
Nothing shows up.
Nothing. So that's the case, right? I mean, that's what happens. I don't know.
Absolutely. Now, where can they go where's the best place to somebody if they say, you know what, I want to start unpacking all this scientific stuff the NDA puts out? Where can they find all this stuff at?
Deerassociation.com. One word. So deerassociation.com is our website. You'll find all of our social platforms linked there. We put out free information about, and we have blogs and videos on YouTube and others by category. So you can get into the hunting category and look up, and a lot of that is science-based. We put out a newsletter. You can sign up for that. It's every Thursday. That is free. It's an email that goes in your inbox. We don't spam you. It's once a week. And then the last thing is we actually have a membership too, which is free. We have a paid membership, but we have a free membership that comes with a couple of goodies, and you can sign up for that. So a lot of free stuff coming from us. Just go to deerassociation.com and you'll find all of it.
You didn't do a good enough job doing that. Let me tell you why. Don't take advantage of their free stuff and not donate or join as a member. Guys, these organizations like the NDA, like Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, like Pope and Young, like your state, your local state body of bow hunters, these people, they give you all of these resources for free, like he just said. But it takes them money to produce those things. They have to pay employees. These conservation efforts aren't free. Pope and Young just put out a thing for the BC Grizzly, and that's not free for Pope and Young to do. When the NDA puts together these studies, they have to pay researchers, they have to pay writers, they have to pay photographers, they have to pay all these people to put together research to give you the free stuff. So you should, if you're a deer hunter, you should absolutely belong to the National Deer Association. If you're an elk hunter, you should absolutely belong to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. If you're a duck hunter, you should absolutely be belonging to Ducks Unlimited. If you're a bow hunter, you should absolutely be a member of Pope and Young. And you should always be a member of your local state body of bow hunters or hunters or duck hunters or deer hunters or whatever you have. If you've got Kansas deer hunters, you need to join that. If you've got Kansas bow hunters, you need to join that, because these people are giving you all of this stuff for free, but it costs them money. So go join the NDA as a membership. Right now they're doing a special for $35. So go join the NDA and become a member today so they can continue putting out this incredible information for you to have to make you more successful and to help us grow bigger and better deer herds nationwide. Guys, I don't need to tell you about the Blazer Vane. You're probably familiar with the Blazer Vane, and you're probably familiar with Boning. Boning has been around forever. It's a name you can trust. They sell products you can trust. They have everything that you need to build your own arrows. All of the jigs to fletch your own arrows, all of the vanes, all of the wraps, the countless, numerous types of vanes and wraps to build any kind of configuration you want. They also have some really cool Fredbear branded products with their Fredbear camo wraps and their Fredbear flannel wraps. Something that's really cool about that Fredbear flannel, that's actually a photo that was taken of one of Fredbear's flannel famous shirts, you know, the red and gray and black that he always wore. That's actually a photo taken of his personal shirt and put on a wrap. It looks really cool, especially on some traditional arrows. But my very favorite configuration, and this is coming from an arrow junkie that's tried out all different kind of vanes and all different kind of configurations, I have found that this configuration stabilizes pretty much every arrow. It's whisper quiet. They fly fantastic. The 3-inch Bronco vane in a 4 fletch absolutely flies like a dart, whether you're shooting mechanicals or big fixed. This is going to be a fletching configuration that will work. Again, whisper quiet, long range accuracy. I love this configuration. This is on every single one of my compound arrows. They just work. Guys, I would highly encourage you to check out Boning, not just for the Blazer vane, but for the Heat vane, for the Broncos, for the X vanes. Everything that you need to build your own arrows is right there on Boning's website. They've been around for ages, and I promise you, if you order from them, you're going to get products that you can trust. Guys, thank you so much for listening. You guys have a fantastic week. Don't listen to Matt. Continue to hunt cold fronts. I'm just kidding. Guys, thank you for listening. Y'all have a fantastic week.
Thanks for having me.